So our next speaker is a friend of the New South Wales Multicultural Health Service, Helen from the University of Macquarie. Helen's professional background is in the fields of translation and interpreting and teaching English as a second language, as a foreign language. She has extensive experience in France and in Australia in both these fields. In translating and interpreting, she worked in France for over 15 years as a freelance translator for UNESCO, the OECD and private enterprise. She started working as a researcher with the National Centre for English Language and Teaching and Research and the Adult Migrant English Program Research Centre in 1996, and has been lecturing in the Department of Linguistics at Macquarie University since 1998 in bilingualism, community interpreting, translation and assessment. Welcome, Helen.
Fully automatic translation is an alluring prospect for organisations that have a commitment to providing translations of multiple documents in multiple languages, such as the Multicultural Health Communication Service. The cost of translation is often one of the most expensive budget items for both public and private enterprises operating in a multilingual environment. Open source machine translation is free for users, but is it up to the job? Over the next few minutes, I'll aim to outline a few key considerations, and I've aimed this interview at a lay audience, so I'll start by an overview of some basic terms, and I hope I'm not stating the obvious to most of you. Firstly, I'd like to thank Chris and Nydia for having invited me to speak. But I don't profess to be a specialist in this area. We have Dr. Stephen Doherty from the University of New South Wales, who it is actually his area of research, so I've invited him to fill in any gaps that I might have in my talk, and as well Christian from TM Translations. So machine translation is a broad term which is used to describe a range of tools and approaches. So it can be represented as a continuum with human translation at the top, the least automated, moving down through to fully automated translation, FAMT. So the human translator generally uses some tools. I don't think there are many people who work by hand on a piece of paper with a pencil, unless they're doing their NAATI test. But hopefully that will no longer be the case soon. And so, of course, translators use a range of tools, and most translators, I assume, would now be using principally online tools. They'd be using speech recognition software, etc. So a range of tools that contribute to the human translation process, generally using a word processor on their computer at home. The fully automated translation, as Anne has mentioned, and you can read in any of the literature, the Google Translate, most of you have had experience with that, Babelfish, etc. So the intermediate stage is, of course, computer-assisted translation. And in computer-assisted translation, we have machine-aided human translation and human-aided machine translation. So in the machine-aided human translation, we have what are known as CAT tools, and most of you would be familiar, I expect, with Trados STL, MemoQ, WordFast, Deja Vu, etc. The human-aided machine translation is what Anne has been talking about, and she's already discussed what statistical machine translation is, and with post-editing. So I won't go into that in any more detail. And supporting the human translation process and the CAT tool process, and also now with integrated systems, we have translation memory. The vast majority of translators say that they use translation memory. I'm not sure how many of you here use translation. How many of the translators here use translation memory? Okay, well, it's nothing like 82%. I don't know how many translators there are, but that's quite a small number. However, in an international study, they found, Lagodaki found that 82.5% of translators surveyed actually used translation memory. The translation memory consists of a database of translated segments. So when you translate a source text and a target text, that goes into the translation memory and is saved in a database, which can then be used when you translate a document that's similar to that in future. It matches the segments that you have in your source text to already translated segments. So it will pop up as being a match of varying degrees. You can modify the way the system matches your source text to your target text. And it's generally used in conjunction with cat tools. So how many of you would use a cat tool here? Yeah, so a few of you again. So anybody who uses a cat tool would be using a translation memory with the cat tool. There's also, well, a general understanding that translation memory improves the consistency of translation if you are translating a very long document, so it would improve the consistency over that document by bringing up the already translated segments with those terms and phrases in there so that you keep using the same term. And also if you're working in a team of translators, it would obviously, you'd be using the same translation memory, so you would get those translation terms coming up. However, Mawkins in 2012 calls into question this notion of consistency, and then there was a study which Stephen Doherty was involved in, which he might like to tell you about, where they looked at how you can improve the consistency or the quality of translation memory by cleaning the data in the memory. Yeah, the quality of the TM is variable depending on the quality of the data, so that if you have a translation memory that has poor translations in there, then that's is what's going to pop up. So you need to make sure that your translation memory is cleaned and has good data in there. It's very useful for repetitive texts and also for retranslations of updated documents. So this is principally in the area of user manuals. I don't know whether, Christian, that's something that you would deal with. So if user manuals that are just updated regularly as new versions of software, for example, come out, then obviously that's going to be a very useful tool to speed up the translation process. Translation memories can be built to support a specific domain or application. Of course, here I'm thinking of the health translation area. Multilingual enterprises that undertake large volumes of translation supply their corporate translation memory to LSPs, language service providers and agencies that supply their translations. And I've been speaking to Cochlear, who are on campus at Macquarie University, and they are very careful about their translation memory. They keep it very clean, and they always send it out to any translators who are working on Cochlear translations, so that they have good quality data to work with. What can we expect from fully automated translation? Well, Anne's already given you a fairly good overview, and some of the questions highlighted some of the issues. Generally, fully automated machine translated, that is with no human intervention, is acceptable where the source text is in a naturally occurring sublanguage. And by that I mean something that is incredibly restricted, so formulaic type language. And one of the examples of that is the Météo system, which is used in Canada for the translation of the weather report. And that is fully automated. It translates something like 45,000 words a day, I think, just automatically with no human intervention, and is very accurate, but it's always the same expressions and lexis, etc. So it's a typical example of where fully automated machine translation would work. The other way you can deal with fully automated machine translation is to actually pre-edit documents. So you can actually restrict the range of lexis and structures to ensure that that document can be translated. So you would bring in a more formulaic use of language. And of course that is only suitable to certain types of texts for certain purposes. And the final area, and I think probably a lot of people use Google Translate for this, is where you only want a very rough estimation of what is in a text. So let's say a scientist wants to know a little bit about the content of a study that's been done, so can put it into Google Translate, doesn't care about the way it's expressed, doesn't care about the stylistics of the text, but really just wants to have an idea of what the content of that text might be. I don't know whether I've missed something vital out there, Stephen, but I think that's basically where we're at the moment. Or Anne, of course, please contribute anything if you're still with us. So Anne has mentioned post-editing, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with post-editing, whether you've actually done any post-editing, but it's a fundamental process if you're going to be using machine translation or even CAT tools. But also in the international standard for translation, of course, we have revising and reviewing, which are a fundamental part of any quality translation process. So even if we're doing fully human translation, we should be getting somebody to revise and check our translations. So basically, post-editing is qualified as light or full, but I don't know how much this is implemented in practice. I expect that it's much more of a continuum of practice, so we can go from very light post-editing, which is just skimming through to make sure that the text is understandable, correcting any grammar mistakes, changing words if they've used a homonym and they've used the wrong one, to full post-editing, which is probably a lot, I expect what most translators would want to do when they receive a machine translation. They want to get the stylistics right. They want to revise that text so it is actually easily read. And CAT tools, there's some nice research by Laubli et al. Looked at CAT tool plus post-edit compared to translation from scratch and found that it was up to 20% faster, and there are other studies that have actually found a higher rate, up to 40% faster than translation from scratch. So that's using a CAT tool, so with translation memory, plus a post-editing. And they found that the translators who went through a process of post-editing actually translated faster, maybe because they knew that there'd be another pair of eyes that are going to look at it afterwards. So some of the challenges in health translation, just very briefly, I was looking for research into the health translation field. I didn't find much that really actually has examined in detail what the challenges are and what the difficulties of source texts are in the health field. But one of the major challenges, of course, and this is what Anne has mentioned and many of you have discussed, is the fact that this is, we're talking about a massive number of languages. And Hutchins and Summers back in 1992 described anything more than 3 languages as the extreme case for machine translation. Now, whether, obviously that's 1992 and things move very fast in this field, so I don't know whether this is still, Stephen, you might have something to say about that, but it's obvious from the comments we've had, what Anne has said, that when you get into languages that what we call the rare and emerging languages here, you're going to have problems with having sufficient data in the machine translation memory to be able to translate those languages. You also have varieties of languages, so you have standard varieties of languages and non-standard varieties, and that's going to pose a problem as well. So you say Spanish, but which variety of Spanish? Are you talking about Spanish from Spain, or are you talking about the varieties from South America, for example? There's what we call in linguistics a large language distance between some of the language pairs. So if you're talking about Tigrinya and English, for example, you would expect a much more language distance than between English and French. So maybe English and French in the machine translation tool comes out sort of okay, but you put in a language like Tigrinya and you won't get anywhere at all with it, and it would be very challenging to actually get that machine translation to a stage where it could be automated to some extent. One of the problems is idiomatic usage in the source text, which is difficult to translate, and variations in registers. Mathilde Nisbeth-Jensen did a nice study in 2013 on patient information leaflets in the European community, looking at Danish, and just how in Danish you would never use Latin-based terms, whereas in English we use Latin-based terms in standard health communication. In Danish that's not acceptable. So a machine translation would automatically translate those as Latin-based terms, but you would need to, the post-editing would need to change all of those registers back down to the common register, so the Danish version of those terms. We know that health-related communication is culturally embedded and therefore very context-dependent. One of the flyers that Nydia gave me access to was about breastfeeding in public. So that would be something where there would be cultural norms that would need to be dealt with differently, depending on the language and the cultural context in which that language would be used. I just put this little extract from the, it's actually from the anterior shoulder dislocation flyer, which is already a bit of a challenge. You did, they were great. And I did actually have a link to it, but I don't think it's going to work. But, you know, I think if you put this into a translation, a machine translation, you're going to have a few problems with things like gently open your fingers so that your hand is flat, then close it and make a fist. Make a fist is going to be problematic. Earlier in the sheet it's got avoid up and away from the body movements. I mean, things like this are just going to be too problematic. I mean, Stephen, I don't know whether you can comment on these, but there are a lot of homonyms in these texts as well. There's also the, I've got these on the next slide actually, I've already mentioned the Latin-based terms. Use of imperatives. I don't know how many of you speak languages where imperatives would be used in this, or whether you'd need to change the grammar systematically. I don't know whether anybody's got something to add there, but imperatives are not necessarily used in this sort of document. So you would not only need to check all the lexis, but you would also need to change the grammar. Of course, there's specialised terminology, elbow flexion and extension. I mean, this is fairly mild. The forearm, but the anterior shoulder dislocation. Spidia, I can't bring up the text, but I know that that PDF actually doesn't work. Okay, so Anne, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Are you here? Oh, great, okay. You're still with us. So I just wanted to refer to your study. You know, there's very little research, as you've mentioned, that specifically addresses the question of the translation of health-related documents, although Stephen and Christian both mentioned a couple of studies that they'd found, and perhaps they can talk about those. But I just thought I'd look at the relevance of your work to our local context. And this is really, you know, novel and promising research in my view. You know, I think the notion of collaborative tools as well, and gradually addressing the language differences that you mentioned earlier as well. So the findings of the study in relation to time, cost and quality are potentially promising, I think, for the health translation using machine translation and post-editing. The results are, at this stage, applicable only to the English-Spanish pair, and as we know, we have multiple languages with more or less linguistic distance. And it relates specifically to the translation of health promotion material, which is relevant, of course, to the work of the Multicultural Health Communication Service. I just had some questions that remain, and I think Melissa's raised a few of the points here, which were about the human translators used in the process. So, particularly in the initial translations, and I know you weren't able to get that data because it was administered through language service providers. But it seems to me that maybe the educational background, the experience of those translators may impact on the outcomes of the study. So I don't know whether you actually have any access to that data as to who the translators were.
Oh, the translators, for when they were sent to vendors, we don't have any way of knowing that. However, for when translations were done within the health department, they had to be done by a certified translator. The translator had to be certified to be a translator. And I don't know. I don't know offhand the years of experience of those particular translators, but they were from the same pool of the people that we had post-editing. Roughly, they were the same education and background.
And would those translators have used any CAT tools in their translation or translation memory?
We did sort of informal observations, and through our conversations, that did not come up. People did not say that they used them.
Right. Yeah. So that potentially would improve the speed of and the quality of the human translations if they were using CAT tools and translation memory. The other question that I had is on the table 2 that you had. Is it correct that you've calculated the costs of each document with an average of all the languages that it was translated into? So, for example, document 6 was translated into Russian, Arabic, Farsi, Amharic, Tigrinya, Somali, Burmese, Karen, and Nepali. So, was the total hours was an average of the hours for the translation of all of those languages?
Yes.
So my question there is really, so there's no Spanish in that one, but my question is really, sorry, yep.
Where possible, if we just had the Spanish information, that those were the numbers we used. If they hadn't translated into Spanish, then we had to use the average of the languages we had. Yeah.
Okay, because I mean, my comment would be that there would be, I assume, large variations in the language, depending on whether it's with Swahili, Amharic, Tigrinya, or Spanish. And your colleague Kirchhoff et al. Reported preliminary findings of a pilot study with Vietnamese, which I think found that the ratings for machine translation quality were lower than for Spanish as well. So the language variability, I think, is probably a major issue, and it'll be interesting to see how the results of your Chinese study go, I think. There are a range of options, I think, to improve the efficiency of health translation, and it seems to me that feasibility will need to be evaluated through a program of research, as Anne has also suggested. I think the translator profile and the processes need to be taken into account. I mean, obviously, if translators are using CAT tools, then that obviously needs to be included in the study. What translation memory are they using? Can we develop translation memory and then test comparisons with machine translation and CAT tools plus translation memory? And of course, the large number of highly variable language pairs is always going to pose a problem. And as Anne says, that if you can save money on the more commonly translated pairs, well, then maybe there's an option to continue to use human translation for the rarer languages. And I thought I'd just finish off with a little anecdote. I was in Vladivostok last week, and I don't speak a word of Russian. I don't know if there are any Russian speakers here. I was staying in a little hotel fairly out of the way of the centre of the city, and on booking.com, where we booked our hotel, it said, "We speak all languages." So I thought, that's promising. So we turned up at the hotel and found that we were communicating via a laptop with Google Translate. So consequently, we didn't have any dinner, and then we went asking about breakfast next morning. So the receptionist understood the word breakfast and typed in Russian and turned the computer around to us, which said eggs, pancakes, fritters. So we thought, okay. And so we nodded, and she said no, and pointed, one. All right, so we had to choose. So we point to the screen, pancakes. And next morning, she turns up with a little plate with just pancakes on it, with nothing on them. And so in terms of, we speak all languages, and human communication, this was a rather frustrating and, disappointing communicative event, I think. So thank you.